right, we are at 1:01. I figured while some people are signing on to Zoom, I can talk to you all a little bit about SCAG for some folks who are not familiar with. So a little background on SCAG just to, before we get our webinar started. It is a MPO, the Regional Transportation Planning Agency, with the population of the region at 19 million people. The SCAG region also encompasses 6 counties, which includes Imperial, Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura. And with all of that, it makes up 191 cities in an area covering about 38,000 square miles. The agency also develops a long-range regional transportation plan, including sustainable community strategy, which they are currently doing right now. So with that said, we are going to get started with the webinar. So given the regional statistics that we've that I just mentioned, wanted to give a brief background on why traffic safety is important. As you can see on this infographic on traffic safety statistics in the overall SCAG region, an average of 1,500 people are killed each year. About 5,200 are seriously injured, and 136,000 people are injured in traffic collisions each year. And while pedestrians and cyclists made up of only 12% of all trips, they accounted for 27% of those killed in collisions throughout the county. And if you're interested in these statistics for your own county, you may access the fact sheets in this link below in this yellow text, which outlines all the fact sheets for all the counties in the SCAG region. So in response to the traffic safety challenges, SCAG has offered a variety of programs, including the Go Human campaign, which aims to prevent serious crashes and encourages walking and biking. And this campaign also provides public agencies with co-branded advertising and marketing resources to educate the public about traffic safety, as well as provide a kit of parts for cities to implement temporary demonstration projects in the community, as you can see in the photo on the right. And that will be covered in our third webinar of our 4-part webinar series. So as part of the Go Human campaign, SCAG had hosted a series of traffic safety training workshops in August of this year throughout the region, which was attended by nearly 200 practitioners in total. And what we learned from these cities and agencies in these workshops were unique issues and challenges in implementing projects and programs when it comes to working in various geographic locations as well as populations throughout the SCAG region. So we designed this webinar to explore a little bit on these issues. And with our agenda for today for our webinar on implementing traffic safety, the Southern California context, we will be talking about community engagement, active transportation as a part of climate resiliency, micromobility options, as well as structuring the narrative on traffic safety. We will also have a Q&A session at the end. All participants who are signed on to Zoom are placed on mute. So if you have a question throughout our discussion, please feel free to use our chat box. We will have a moderator to look at the questions, and we'll engage in a discussion from there. And also this presentation will also be saved and recorded. So we will provide information at the end of the webinar. So with that said, here is our esteemed panelist speakers for today, who have extensive experience in implementing traffic safety at the local level. So I'm going to invite them to provide a really brief 2 to 3 minute introduction about who they are and about their organization in relation to traffic safety. And we will start with Rebecca. Zaragoza with the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Rebecca.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Zaragoza. I am a senior policy advocate with the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. We are a social and environmental justice community-based organization, and we work in both the San Joaquin Valley and in the Eastern Coachella Valley. I am based in the Eastern Coachella Valley, and our organization focuses on different environmental justice issues across the state, where we work with different disadvantaged and environmental justice communities. And some of those issues include transportation, affordable housing, water and wastewater infrastructure, air quality and climate issues, and also land use. And so my specific role is focusing on air quality and transportation, and working specifically with the communities in the Eastern Coachella Valley, which is in the eastern portion of Riverside County.
Great, thank you. Moving on to Kevin Shin with Walk Bike Long Beach. Kevin? Oh no, I think we lost. Oh, there you are.
No, I'm here. Sorry, it was on mute.
No worries.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Shin, and I am the co-chair and co-founder of Walk Bike Long Beach. We are the local chapter of the LA County Bicycle Coalition in Long Beach, Lakewood, and Signal Hill. And Walk Bike Long Beach, being a little bit different from some of the other LACBC chapters that you may be familiar with, we have a particular focus on equity. So most of our work takes place in Central, North, and West Long Beach, not to the exclusion of work in other parts of Long Beach, Lakewood, and Signal Hill, but we've identified those three communities as the primary communities in the area that have the greatest equity needs and the greatest lack of infrastructure for walking and biking. So we work in all of these communities to try and improve the infrastructure, and we educate and engage the communities to help them learn how to advocate for their own needs. So taking an approach that isn't just about coming in and advocating on behalf of these communities, but really moving into those communities, working closely with the members and residents of the community to ensure that they are empowered and prepared to be able to fight for the changes that are needed, to fight for additional investment in their communities, and to ensure that their communities receive the fair share of city investment for infrastructure improvements.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And lastly, we have John Yee with Los Angeles Walks. John.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is John. I'm with Los Angeles Walks. I'm the executive director, and I actually just started maybe about 6 months ago. So my background is primarily in community organizing. Before this, I was actually with the American Lung Association doing tobacco organizing, and before that, doing education organizing. But yeah, it's super exciting to be in this work and learning about some of the great partners in this area. So really excited about today's conversation. Los Angeles Walks is, like some of the other folks on today's panel, we're a nonprofit. We are a community organizing advocacy group. We partner with local community groups on helping them realize some local safe street changes. So simple stuff, well, I shouldn't say simple, but seemingly simple stuff like a stop sign, a curb out, improving sidescape, stuff like that. We help community members engage the city in an often unresponsive bureaucratic process at times on getting these local changes done. And then we partner with them to sort of get them elevated into positions of power. So whether it's getting appointed to the Pedestrian Advisory Committee, or encouraging them to run for local neighborhood councils, really making sure that our members end up at tables and at circles where they can influence not only policy, but popular narratives around our streets and our roads, and to really challenge this narrative that LA is a car-centric city. So that's a little bit about what we do.
Great, thank you, John. Great to have all three of you. And for those who just joined, my name is Winnie Fong with Estelano Advisors. I will be moderating the discussion for today. This leads to our very first question. So we'll begin with our question about community engagement, and what we learned from the workshops back in August is how important engagement is when it comes to implementing a traffic safety project and program, and how it might look different based on specific community needs. So we'll start with Rebecca, the Leadership Council, on how, with her experience engaging with the communities in the East Coachella Valley. Rebecca?
Yeah, can you do the next slide, please?
Oh, yes.
So, so I think we all really understand that effective and meaningful community engagement is the most important process when it comes to planning for any type of community development project, but I think that it looks different in each community, and it should be tailored effectively to each community that we all work in. I work specifically in the Eastern Coachella Valley, which is a rural and agricultural region in the eastern portion of Riverside County. And this area has one city, which is the city of Coachella, but also has 4 unincorporated communities in the region, which are Thermal, Oasis, Mecca, and North Shore. And so these are all desert communities. They are agricultural and farm working communities. Since the census is coming up, they are also referred to as hard to count communities. And there's also a really large difference between the eastern portion of the Coachella Valley and the western portion of the Coachella Valley. There are many disparities in the entire region. And so that further perpetuates, you know, a very disinvested in area. And there's very limited built infrastructure in the communities, and most residents who live in the Eastern Coachella Valley are predominantly of Latino descent who live in small mobile home park communities. And a lot of the folks that we work with work in the agriculture industry, the hospitality industry, and basically sustain the wealth and the success of what is the Western Coachella Valley, which is the areas that you might know as like Palm Springs, Indian Wells, all of those areas. And so given the geography and the conditions of the built environment in the region that I work in, it's much harder to reach residents compared to more urban areas like the LA or more inland communities. And homes in this area are also very spread apart. There aren't many public facilities in the region that provide the opportunity or the space for people to congregate. Next slide. But regardless of how difficult or time-consuming organizing in and engaging rural communities is, we still have to think about how we communicate and how we try to do our best to reach the communities that we work in. And so what we've done in the past is we really go back to the basics, and so we do all of our organizing through door-to-door outreach. We engage with already organized groups like schools, churches, senior centers, and also host our own community meetings, which are held on a regular and monthly basis. But we also try to build relationships with the residents that we work with. And we try to build relationships with different elected officials and other local organizations and regional and statewide organizations who have the power to make change in communities like the Eastern Coachella Valley and in other communities across the state. And we make sure that all of the outreach and engagement, whether it's done by us or by partners or state agencies, that they are done in accessible languages, that they are done at times that are convenient for folks, and that folks have, that we create an environment that is accessible to everybody who is in the community and who has a stake on the issue that we might be working in. But overall, I think that we should follow a process where we are intentional and transparent about the project or work that we're doing, that we build trust and strengthen community partnerships, After all, the residents that we work with are the ones who are living in the community. They have the most knowledge about what they want and the solutions that they need. And as organizers and as people who work with organizations or agencies, we need to consider the differences that exist between one community and another, because one community isn't the same. Although the issues might be the same, it's still important to tailor our approach to a specific community. And so I think we also have to engage residents throughout every step of the process, and not just, collect input and then never go back again to the community, but really try to follow up and ensure that plans are representative, and so that community can see the final product of what their engagement was. So that's a little bit about how we do engagement in the Eastern Coachella Valley. I know that a lot of folks may not hear from little communities as often, but it's definitely something that we've been trying to elevate and trying to improve the process as to how cities or different jurisdictions approach community engagement with rural communities and urban communities.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was very insightful. And moving west to the Skag region, we're going to segue to Kevin Shin with Walk Bike Long Beach to talk a little bit more about his work in the communities out in the Long Beach area, specifically the Anaheim corridor. Kevin?
Great. So, as I mentioned before, Walk Bike Long Beach focuses primarily in Central North and West Long Beach, which we've identified as areas that have the greatest need for infrastructure improvement in the Long Beach, Lakewood, and Signal Hill area. What's unique about the Anaheim corridor is that, unfortunately, it gets used as an urban freeway, frequently as a cut through to avoid traffic on the 405, which, as many of us are pretty familiar with, is oftentimes an absolute disaster. And it's heavily trafficked by cars and buses throughout the course of the day, but it's also a very residential community. It immediately to the north of the street and the south of the street are primarily residential communities, with the actual Anaheim corridor itself being fairly commercial, lots of shops, restaurants, and community, community assets, other things that people want to be able to get to and visit and utilize during the course of their day. So we have just, we've tracked and continue to track the amount of traffic and usage for that street. And unfortunately, it consistently is one of, if not the corridor with the highest rate of pedestrian and bike collisions, as well as fatal collisions in the city of Long Beach. So it's a very problematic corridor, and because it does run through an area that is pretty heavily people of color, it's pretty heavily lower income communities, and it runs through the neighborhood of Cambodia Town. It really bisects the neighborhood of Cambodia Town, which is the largest population of Cambodians outside of the country of Cambodia, and has a significant number of monolingual Khmer-speaking individuals that reside there. So lots of problems, lots of challenges with that street. And we have made, one of our early efforts was really to dive into this community and to work closely with the Khmer community as a way to engage and help them improve and fight for improvements on Anaheim Street to make it safer for pedestrians, safer for cyclists. When, as a part of LACBC, we did Operation Firefly in it was 2017. In 2017, we handed out over 75 sets of bike lights in less than 2 hours to people who were just riding along the street. And we weren't even doing this near the Blue Line Metro Station, which is about about 10 blocks to the west of where we were located. We were actually located kind of in the heart of Cambodia town, and we still handed out 75 sets of bike lights. These were all people who mainly used biking as their primary mode of transportation. And these were all people who were primarily looking to get to their job or get home from work, people who lived in the community. So it's a way of, it was just an indication to us that that area is heavily trafficked by pedestrians, it's heavily trafficked by cyclists, but it's also used extremely, it has cars driving through at a very high rate of speed. It has a lot of buses that run along the corridor. There's just an extreme confluence of traffic that takes place there. So over the course of about an 18-month period, Walk Bike Long Beach, in partnership with some of the local organizations, the May Center and United Cambodian Communities, we worked with them to set up a series of events, walk audits and bike rides, and we actually took advantage of the city's, one of the city's beach streets, open streets events to conduct a bike tour of the Anaheim corridor as well. So throughout the course of these events, we made an effort to work with the local community to really get their input, to really gather from them what they felt was important to change and what were the real needs that they felt they needed to have met in order to be able to enjoy their community more, in order to make it feel like it was safe for them to be able to walk in the community, to be able to bike in the community, and to really be able to make sure that they had a consistent level of service from the local public transit agency, which conveniently actually has their headquarters located on Anaheim Street as well. So we, during the course of things like walk audits, we work closely with some of our local partners to identify things like bringing in culturally appropriate food, making sure that we had translation services in both Khmer and Spanish for monolingual speakers. We wanted to make sure that anybody in the community could participate, so we kept the process very analog, and we intentionally made sure that rather than relying purely on digital communication for outreach, we actually sent volunteers into the community to door knock and encourage people to come out and attend. So for our walk audits, we typically saw around 15 to 25 people. For the bike rides, we were somewhere closer to about 30 to 40 people participating. And we recognize that, this is still a relatively small sampling of individuals, but we were able to use that initial sort of engagement with them to help people recognize and understand the process of how to, how to advocate and what are some of the potential changes that could be made to the street in order to make it safer, in order to make it more comfortable and more usable for them. So what you see on the screen right now is our photographs from one of our walk audits. And you'll see, we set up a tent at the May Center in order to kind of serve as our start and end point, and as a way for people to kind of have a place that they could gather. And we worked with the May Center to also provide some snacks and some food. They have a small farm stand there, so we were able to purchase some of their produce and use that to make and provide some lunch for the participants as well. So can we go to the next slide, please? And as we progressed along the walk audit, we worked with the folks there to kind of really observe closely what were some of the things that you're seeing. What are some of the challenges? You'll see the photograph on the left here. This is one of the only bus stops on Anaheim Street that actually has any kind of shade. This bus stop is immediately outside of Long Beach Transit's headquarters. So this is the only location along Anaheim Street that has a covered bus stop. So this is one of the things that we pointed out to participants and worked with them to help them think about, like, as you're going through your day and you are taking the bus to get to from place to place, how many of the locations that you're visiting where you have to wait for a bus actually has a covered stop, actually has shade provided, is close to things that you need to be able to access. You'll see a gentleman in the middle, you'll see a gentleman riding a bicycle through a crosswalk. So we talked with the participants about, how does that make you feel? Does that feel safe to you? When you're riding a bike, do you ride on the sidewalk or do you ride on the street? And then the photograph on the right is actually one of our volunteers. He was a high school student who was a Khmer speaker and actually served as our translator during the course of this particular walk audit. During these walk audits, we've had a number of, we had a lot of good response, but we also had a number of real challenges, including during the course of one of the walk audits, the participants actually witnessed an accident happen where an individual driving along Anaheim Street collided with a parked car and immediately and actually pushed that parked car up onto the sidewalk within about 10 feet of the group that was walking by. So, these are some of the types of real life observations that we can't begin to emulate in a closed environment. This is really where, going out onto the street and kind of sharing with people as we walk through and experience the actual street design and discuss what the challenges are, discuss how they would like to see improvements. And so from all of that, we were able to kind of glean a lot of great insight. So next slide, please. And, we really tried to make sure that our group was comprised of insights that were coming from a wide variety of audiences. And so that meant people of all ages. We had young folks. I think the youngest participant we had on one of the walk audits was around 7 or 8. The elders of the community came out and supported the effort as well. And we were able to kind of show them aspects of their community that they, many of them, are familiar with, but sort of seeing them in a new light. So next slide. So from that, we were able to kind of really glean a ton of great insight and great information from that community. We worked with that community to help them feel comfortable enough to kind of talk about this topic and actually encourage them and brought them out to the Long Beach City Planning Commission in order to advocate and fight to have Anaheim Street incorporated into the city's bike master plan. We also asked them to turn out for city council and help to prepare them and guide them through the process of making a public statement in front of a general city council meeting when the city council was looking to adopt the bike master plan. And then in addition to that, we gathered all of the information and pulled it together into a brochure. So one of the items that we included on that brochure is blown up here because I really wanted to kind of highlight this. This is a heat map of Anaheim Street. And this is all just during the course of a less than 10-year period. And you can see where this stretch of Anaheim Street has a lot of dark red spots. And it's primarily along Anaheim itself, but it's also creeping into areas that are immediately off of the street because there are some major intersections here as well. But this is an indication to us that there's a real problem that needs to be addressed here. And this was kind of the starting point for why we engaged with the Khmer community and really started that process of working with them. Next slide. And at the end of the day, we took all of the feedback and everything that we collected and we distilled it down into a series of insights that we felt were important to track and maintain, and then took that in and worked with a designer to pull together a brochure that we've started to use and distribute with council members, that we've started to socialized with the community, that we've started to share with our partner organizations as a way to, highlight what are the key assets along Anaheim Street. What are some of the challenges that the community feels like still need to be addressed, and what are some of the things that we can do to actually begin to tackle some of those challenges. So this type of brochure, we've seen a good amount of success with. And one of our next steps is really to ensure that we, because the brochure is only available right now in English, we wanted to make sure that it's also available to the local population in Khmer as well as in Spanish. So that's one of the next steps that we're going to be taking to help ensure. But ultimately, the campaign itself has actually had some real positive impact. The city is starting to look at how they can change out portions of the median along Anaheim Street in order to reduce the crossing distances and provide more shelter for pedestrians that are looking to cross the street. In addition, we're in discussions with Long Beach Transit about converting a part of, or possibly the entirety of, the Anaheim corridor into a transit-only into a transit priority corridor with a bus-only lane. So that would help limit the amount of car traffic, and it would actually improve the overall flow and hopefully make the entire neighborhood feel a little bit better. There's still going to be a lot of work to be done in this community, but we felt like this was at least a good starting point for helping to make sure that that community felt like they were seeing some changes and seeing some improvements to make that community be safer and more walkable and more inviting for the folks that live there.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. A lot of great work that your team has done out in Long Beach. So moving on, I'd like to invite John to talk a little bit about your work in engaging with other populations, specifically the elderly population, when it comes to traffic safety, education, and encouragement. So I'm gonna punt it over to you, John, with this.
Thank you. I apologize. I am not as visually as appealing as my other speakers, but yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about safe routes for seniors. And let me just begin by saying, that I think this is, for me, it's pretty personal. I'm already starting to talk to my parents about retirement. And in that conversation, which I am sure I'm not the only one on this call who's had that talk with their parents or will soon have that talk, transportation accessibility is always part of that conversation. Where does mom or dad or our parents, where do they want to move? And does it have transportation accessibility? And what does that mean for our family? And what does that mean for the services that they need? And so whether we know it or not, safe routes for seniors is going to be an issue we all face one day, whether it's ourselves or our family members. And so I always like to sort of bring it back, saying that these issues are everyone's issues. We are all walkers in the city. So yeah, I sort of wanted to begin with that. As you know, we have an aging population with baby boomers. They say there's an average of 10,000 hitting retirement every day in America. And so there's going to be, in the next few decades, a number of graying of our population. And that's going to have impact when it comes to housing and especially when it comes to transportation. In dense communities like LA, you're going to have a lot of multi-unit housing, senior housing centers with a lot of these seniors who live in there. And I think also it's worth noting is a lot of immigrant communities are also graying here in Los Angeles. And so the senior population isn't this one large behemoth, but it has sub-communities within themselves. And so what does that mean when it comes to housing? What does that mean when it comes to transportation for these communities? I think is what makes the issue a little more complicated when it comes for public policy. So a little bit of background for LA Walks. We've worked with LA DOT on their Safe Routes for Seniors programs. We've also done some community actions. The image you see in front of you here is something we did, the walk, roll, or stroll with residents of Union Tower. We did some exercise with them, and then we went around their communities and did a walk, sort of a walk audit, where we assessed the different assets they were out there, and what are some assets that they need that they're lacking, what are some good assets that they have good access to. So those are some of the conversations that we had. And so I want to spend this time, I think, to give you guys some practical tips of some lessons that we've learned along the way when approaching the senior community that we think will be helpful for you. Just off the bat, I think, time, place, format are always things you have to consider when having any kind of community engagement. But I think one thing that oftentimes is not in that list when we talk about seniors is the pace of the meeting. I think for a lot of us, our meetings we often slow our meetings down. We have breaks in between. The idea of having someone sit down for 3 hours straight and having a conversation, that might not be something as appealing for seniors. And so making sure the pace works. And so I just wanted to throw that in there. But there's 3 major sort of tips I wanted to provide you all on to keep in mind, a sort of a checklist when you go in and engage communities with the senior community. So the first and foremost is, when we talk about seniors, I think it's important to ask ourselves which seniors we're talking about. And so I think it's important to be innovative when you're actually trying to go and access seniors. If we're looking at communities of color, if you're looking at immigrant communities, especially communities that do not speak English, that are monolingual, where are their seniors and how are we accessing them? Are we looking beyond, the senior recreation centers? Are there more non-traditional places where seniors gather? I know, for example, I live in Koreatown, and the McDonald's is a very popular spot for a lot of for seniors in the AAPI community. So is there any engagement when it comes to them there? Is there any consideration when it comes to these kind of spaces for seniors? Are they accessible, and are we creating environments for them to really be able to have fellowship and socialize in these spaces? Are we looking at faith-based organizations? A lot of seniors engage with faith-based organizations, and a lot of these churches, synagogues, mosques, they have sort of groups and sort of gatherings for seniors specifically. So that's another place to engage. How are they getting to those places? Senior associations and clubs, PTA meetings as well. You'll be surprised, well, maybe none of you guys are surprised, but a lot of our seniors are actually caregivers for children. And so they attend PTA meetings and play a parent's role. So that's another place where we can engage. Another question then is, who is not showing up? Who is isolated? Who is at home and not going out into the public? Because they are also seniors as well. And if anything, they are a product of a lack of accessibility. So how are we accessing them? Are we developing partnerships with home delivery companies, home services companies, or nonprofits that do services for seniors in their homes? Are we utilizing those partners to find out where our seniors are? So that's the first bucket that I would provide. The second area is consider the seniors as family status. There's a difference when you engage multi-generational families living in one home versus multi-generational families living in apartments versus seniors who live in a senior housing apartment separate from the direct family. So we're considering all those different sort of living situations that our seniors find themselves in. Is your approach diverse enough to hit all of those different buckets? What does mobility look like for a senior when they have a relative who can drive versus a relative who can't? It's 70% of LA Transit users do not own cars. So that means like 70% of our LA Transit users are in families without cars. And so for those families that have seniors, what does mobility look like for them if they have no access to a car, period? What does mobility look like for a family with one car that's shared versus a family who has an abundance of cars where everyone can kind of drive? So I think being able to really look at the different family statuses of each community and figure out, what are the assets that they have and, how limited or how liberating are those for our seniors. And the final third bucket, I would say, is looking at seniors in their diverse roles. Oftentimes, I think it's easy to see seniors as someone who's just the older part of the family who resides at home and doesn't do much, but the seniors have extremely active lives and active responsibilities in families. They're caretakers of children, so they navigate to school, they navigate the children to churches, daycare. Seniors are also care providers for their spouses, and they're also patients. So they also have to navigate hospitals, they have to go to pharmacies. And also, how accessible are we making families to their seniors? If seniors do not live close to their families in a senior center, are families able to get to them in ease, or are seniors able to go to their immediate family in ease? And what role does this have with depression and isolation? And so just to summarize, I think the 3 areas that I would recommend as of a checklist is first, be innovative in your ways you reach and approach your seniors. Consider their family status and their family situation. And finally, I would look at seniors in their multiple diverse roles that they have in their families. And so, yeah, I would just end with this, is with that, Safe Routes for Seniors, when people talk about that, people usually think of it as, making sure we expand access for community members. And I think that is important, right? Expanding access for seniors is key. But I think also you have to consider, as the flip side is, how are we making transportation then fit with their lifestyle and their family style, right? So I think those are the 2 that's the second critical part that I always would like to emphasize when approaching seniors. And so, yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, John. Also in the same boat as you, and and talking with my parents and their retirement plans. And thank you for sharing the checklist. That was very helpful. Moving on to the second question. So SCAG's Go Human campaign, as we mentioned earlier, encourages people to walk and bike more, which also benefits the environment to get people out of the car, which one reduces VMT, vehicle miles traveled, as well as GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. So our next question focuses more on how do we advocate for active transportation as part of climate resiliency. So I'll start with Rebecca with Leadership Council to talk about her work in environmental justice planning. Switch it to the next slide. Rebecca?
Thank you. So I think we can all agree that we're at a time where all planning and project implementation processes should be addressing climate resilience, and especially given, all of these conversations that we're having about climate change at the global level, right? And so even, all of the communities that we're talking about today and where many of us work in and also potentially live in are disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and communities of color, right? And so all of them are environmental justice communities and are already experiencing the negative impacts of climate change and have been for a very long time. And so environmental justice communities are much more vulnerable than any other type of community to the impacts of climate change, and we know that. And so that's sort of the approach that we lead all of our work in the Eastern Coachella Valley and in the San Joaquin Valley, is how can we help make communities much more resilient and sustainable. Now, because the region and geography of the Eastern Coachella Valley is very different from an urban area, we don't have any significant amount of active transportation infrastructure. It's like I said earlier, it's a very rural area, very limited built infrastructure. And the residents that we work with rely a lot on cars to get around, especially to go to work, to go to the doctor's appointments, to grocery shopping, and to reach any other type of resource that they need. And even the transit system that we have locally isn't the most reliable option because of the low frequency. But what we've been trying to do is work to connect small pockets within the unincorporated area to encourage folks to walk and bike more within their own communities. And so you can see some images of the Eastern Coachella Valley. You can see a lot of the shoulders of the roads are unpaved. And the top picture is, you can barely see the stop sign, which is a bus stop sign actually, which is just a pole on the side of the road. There's no bench, there's no shade structure, and so all of that is very impactful on folks who rely on public transit. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so for the past several years or so, we've been working on developing a regional mobility plan for the 4 unincorporated communities of the Eastern Coachella Valley, which would bring biking and pedestrian infrastructure to the area. And so during that process, we were able to plan in partnership with community residents about what were their priorities, which corridors they wanted to focus on for this type of infrastructure. And once we finished the first portion of the mobility plan, we actually partnered with the county and different local organizations, and we applied for an active transportation grant from the state, and we were awarded a $6.8 million grant to implement one of the projects that the community identified throughout the planning process. And so the first project that will be implemented is the one that you can see on the map. It's a small little region in the communities of Thermal and Oasis that will connect several mobile home park communities, 4 different schools, markets, and even a future park that's currently being planned in the community. And these infrastructure and traffic safety improvements will not only encourage folks to get out of their cars and help reduce GHGs and VMTs, but it will also help mitigate other environmental impacts and help improve public health as more and more people begin to use the amenities once they're there. Like you saw in the recent picture where the shoulder of the road was unpaved, a picture on this slide where you can see sort of like how the project will be implemented or what it could look like on the top right corner, which will now have a sidewalk but also a bike path for folks to use along those corridors. But you know, since the Eastern Coachella Valley looks mostly like the picture before, where most roads are unpaved, shoulders are unpaved, there are a lot of air quality impacts and public health impacts that people in the Eastern Coachella Valley have been dealing with for all of history, right? And so air quality in the region is a very big issue for a lot of the folks that we work with. And this is one way that we've been able to change the face of the community, and in conjunction with other climate resilient projects that we're working on will hopefully help reduce the air quality impacts that people are feeling right now. But there are also other issues that we deal with in the Eastern Coachella Valley when it comes to unpaved roads and the lack of active transportation infrastructure. For example, when there are heavy rain seasons, these roads or shoulders are also become very muddy and hard to use, and so that prevents people from moving. It prevents people from getting out of their communities to go to work because their cars can't make it out, or people can't walk to school because it's too muddy to use the side of the road. There are also really, really strong windstorms in the area, and given that this is a desert region that perpetuates really strong dust storms, which again produce not only affect the air quality in the area, but also make it really dangerous for both drivers and pedestrians and bicyclists to be out and about in the communities. And so in addition to the bike and pedestrian infrastructure that we've been planning for in this mobility plan, we're also integrating transit infrastructure, but also more traffic safety infrastructure like better crosswalks, better lighting, barriers that help protect those that are using the bike lanes and the sidewalks. And so all of these changes will now help mitigate those climate change impacts that we face in the Eastern Coachella Valley. And so these are just a few examples on how these types of projects can help advance climate resilience. But we do often encounter different individuals and agencies that believe that there's no worth in investing in rural communities because of the low density, for example, and how you won't get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. But first, we do need to be able to provide these options for residents, which they are asking for. The advocacy is there and the needs are there. And we need to be able to address those asks and implement these types of projects to provide them the options or abilities to create a more sustainable community. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. I also want to give a shout out to your region. Your neighborhood mobility plan for Thermal Oasis communities just won the California Chapter American Planning Association Awards for Best Transportation Planning document. So, yeah, so people should check that out. So moving on to our next speaker on this topic. Move it to the next slide. John, you want to speak a little bit more on your thoughts on climate resiliency?
Yes, sorry, I have to unmute 2 times. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, let me first explain the picture that you have in front of you. There's a bit of a feedback. Okay, it's gone. So this is a picture we took up in Panorama City, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But here you see clearly on the right, you have a bus stop, a shelter bus stop. Then on the left, you see that people are actually making their own makeshift seating to be under the shade. And I know this is a game that almost everyone who's walked in LA has probably played, right? Where you're waiting at the cross section and you try to, hide your head behind the stoplight or one little sign, and you're just trying to get that little shade that you can to cover your body. Yeah, I think that's a game that we all play here in LA, and I think this image that we have is a sort of a clear depiction of Angelenos having to figure out how to provide themselves with shade, despite the bus shelter being right there. Bless you. So with that, I think it's worth saying that we have one of the worst air quality in LA. I think for all the metropolitan areas, I think we are number 2 in the country for the worst air quality. We have an F according to the American Lung Association, and it's been like that for a few years now. And so oftentimes what we have found in our organizing work is that the state of your streets directly reflects the state of the environment. So if you have a pretty crappy streetscape, crumbling infrastructure, most likely you're also living with poor air quality. And we find that correlation pretty tightly knit. But I think having said that, what we've often find is that climate change is not a priority for our communities, and understandably so. When your communities are being over-policed, when you have issues on immigration, when you're just trying to get to your job and having difficulties with transit, someone coming and saying that climate change is an issue and that we need to fight for climate change, it's not really a priority. And I think a lot of communities see that. And so for us, as a nonprofit doing safe street work, we're finding ourselves having to sort of reframe things or even relearn ourselves as an organization on what climate change means in this context of this work. And so something that we found is that when we talk about sort of climate resiliency, we're finding that we have to speak it in terms of streetscape. So let me give you an example. One of the communities that we work with is in Wilmington. So that's down in the port area. And so they have an arguably pretty awful streets. They have a lot of freight traffic. I don't know if folks have driven down that area, but I mean, you can even smell it. And so they have a lot of overflow of freight traffic from the freeways. And so the air quality is not the best. And so for them, safe streets, yes, it could be slowing down traffic. It could be, having more improved streetscape, having bike lanes. But for a city like Wilmington, actually having safer streets is having cleaner air, limiting the kinds of vehicles that go through their neighborhoods, putting in more stop signs or speed bumps to slow down traffic. So for them, that is a direct tie to air quality. But to come in and say this is strictly about climate resiliency can often is not really that doesn't resonate as much. In a city like Panorama City, up in the north part of our city, we found that, a lot of residents, for them, a climate issue is a lack of shade. They're notorious for having bus stops out there that is just sort of a stand, and that's it. So a lack of shading, creating more bus shelters, having more greenery in the streetscape is, for them, their response to climate resiliency. And so being able to talk in those terms about how the streetscape can connect directly to climate change, I think is something that we found useful. And so I know our ultimate goal is to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles from the road. And so any move to encourage active transportation over cars moves us further in the fight for against the climate crisis. So just to summarize, in our framing, we make a direct link on how active transportation impacts their communities, putting in real tangible benefits. So having more shade, so they don't have to wait in the blazing sun. Making those really tangible for them beyond fighting the climate crisis is how we've seen the key to our organizing.
Great. Thank you, John. Kevin, do you have anything to add?
Sure. So I think, to John's point, there's just a lot of stuff that goes on in the south part of LA County. The Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach are right up against the western part of the city of Long Beach. And as a result, we see a lot of the pollution from the 710 freeway. We see a lot of the freight movement causing air quality issues. We also have immediately over the border in Carson are a number of oil refineries that release a lot of different toxic chemicals into the air and create a lot of unpleasant smells for our residents in West Long Beach. So, when we talk about climate resiliency, all of those things matter. And in addition to that, because the LA River runs right through part of Long Beach, and Long Beach is on the coast, Long Beach has kind of a unique situation when it comes to climate resiliency and climate change, in that our climate action and adaptation plan has to look at the possibility of sea level rise. And with sea level rise in Long Beach, there are entire neighborhoods that, in a matter of, with a matter of an additional, 1 or 2 inches of sea level rise could, it could, in a matter of years, flood entire neighborhoods that currently, where it's primarily residents, where it's a primarily residential neighborhood. So that's going to have a lot of impact on a lot of people. And as sea level rise continues to pose a problem, as as we continue to have challenges with heavier storms and more intense rain, periods of rain. This year we saw a significant amount of rain, and as a result, we saw significant amounts of flooding in parts of Long Beach, which is not something that has been as dramatic of a problem in the past. But the LA River was channelized as a way to do flood control, and we're already starting to see points where there is the possibility that at some point that the water is going to reach a level where it's going to supersede the banks of the LA River and therefore cause problems in Long Beach's neighborhoods. So I think there's a lot of different pieces to climate resiliency as we look at how we adjust and change our use of transportation and look for transportation alternatives and look to reduce the amount of traffic from goods movement and freight movement. All of these play a role in helping us identify and figure out ways to fight climate change, not just because it's the right thing to do. It's a necessary step to ensure that many of our communities, even outside of communities of color and lower income communities, it's a way to kind of bring some of those other folks into the conversation and ensure that they understand that we're not doing this to make their lives less convenient. We're doing this because this is really an important aspect of how we're going to be able to all move forward together and really make our communities, make it possible for our communities to continue to exist.
Thanks, Kevin. I think you made a really good point as well. Our community should also start thinking about our stormwater infrastructure and using that as a way to redesign our streets as we think about traffic safety and developing our street infrastructure. So thank you for your insight from the panelists on that question. And to piggyback on that, we're thinking about encouraging people to get more out of their cars more. And as we see that, we're seeing a wave of new micromobility options, such as dockless e-scooters and e-bikes. Some cities are learning to embrace this technology as a means to reducing both VMT and GHG, while other cities may find them as a nuisance in their community and are implementing policies to ban these micromobility vehicles. So the next question, opening up to the panelists, are what are the benefits and challenges with these new mobility options in your community? And I'll start out with you, Kevin.
Great, thanks. So the City of Long Beach has been trialing some of the micromobility options. We brought in dockless bikes for our bike share program. We have just started or just completed our trial period for the e-scooters, and it's been both positive and negative in a lot of different ways. In terms of positives, we are starting to see more and more people consider that using these alternatives is a great way to get around town that doesn't rely on them getting in a car, doesn't have them dealing with parking, doesn't have them dealing with a lot of the challenges that come with driving. But on the negative side, it's also highlighting to people where there are challenges with the infrastructure. The lack of bike infrastructure means people end up doing things that are inappropriate, like riding e-scooters on sidewalks. It's also where we're starting to see a greater impact of road design, because all of a sudden you've got, in addition to bikes, you now have e-scooters, you now have e-bikes, you now have all kinds of different mobility options taking advantage of bicycle lanes throughout the city. So I think there's just a lot of different positives and negatives to this movement. But one of the things that we have found, both as Walk Bike Long Beach in the Long Beach context, but also in the context of the LA County Bike Coalition and the larger LA region, is that we are seeing more and more people choose to use these micromobility options as an alternative to as a potential alternative to driving. There's still a large number of these micromobility options that are actually taking the place of walking trips, because most of them are designed for very short ranges, and they're typically focused on kind of a 1 to 3 mile range for trips. But we're also starting to see those same people, again, begin to recognize and realize that there's a need for improved infrastructure. And so those same people who are now considering using micromobility options as a part of their greater transportation ecosphere, there's a good chance that they will now start to consider, using that e-scooter was pretty easy. I need to go a little bit further, or I need to carry a little bit more stuff, and the e-scooter is not really appropriate for that. Maybe I can take a bike share bike. And as we start to make sort of these types of publicly available, publicly shared resources that help people pick transportation options that are not driving, I think one of the things that we hope to see is more and more of these individuals will choose those options, will choose those alternatives, and start to build from that up to biking more frequently for sort of a medium distance, considering public transportation as an alternative for the slightly longer distances, and to kind of create these different, create a transition from each of the different modes up to the other as people get more and more comfortable with using them for longer periods of transit.
Great, thank you, Kevin. John, this question's for you, kind of segueing that conversation. We know, as Kevin mentioned, we were seeing these people ride scooters out on the streets, and sometimes they're parked on and blocking sidewalks. So wanted to hear your thoughts on some of the challenges that we're seeing with these new mobility options.
Yeah, definitely. Before I just dive into that, I do want to just go back on Kevin's point, which I think you put it really well. I think this micromobility, these options are just part of a larger constellation of our transit modes. And, we're discussing, these options on a SCAG webinar, right? And so that must mean that there's a mass number of people using it because it's part of public policy discussions, it's causing controversy. And so what that tells me is that these micromobility options are providing a need that traditional means are not. And I think that's really worth acknowledging. Like cars, subways, walking, biking, I really feel like people who use these options, they're like everyone else who's just trying to go to A to B the best way they can and the safest way they can. And so I think from my perspective, I think this is part of the sort of the landscape. I think we need to build our environments to support this landscape that's safe for everyone that's on the streets. And so to the point earlier about how the e-scooters and e-bicycles really do occupy some of the sidewalk space and are a challenge for a lot of our members who have disabilities, who have walkers, who have rollers. And so they do present a challenge. And what I would say is the criticism, not so much the scooters, but what is the built environment that we've created and the policies that we've created to sort of serve these different kinds of modes. And so what should our response be? And so that's sort of what my response would be, is that we need to create a more clear expectation and clear laws in our city about using these micromobility issues. So a few things is, first and foremost, clear laws. If you go look at any of the e-scooters, it says no riding on the sidewalks, but you have to park them on the sidewalks. So it's sort of, that in itself is sort of an oxymoron. So I think we just need clear policies for our members and for our community members on using these products. The other thing is I think we need to institutionalize micromobility options in driver's education. I think we could do more of that with pedestrian and bicyclists as well, but definitely making this part of our education when it comes to drivers, so that they know that this is part of the landscape, so that when they're driving, it's not the first time they see it or know about it isn't someone they see on the street. So this is a part of the larger streets family that we have. And the third is, I would say we need to build our built environment to meet the needs of changing mobility, not change our mobility to meet the needs of our current built environment. So oftentimes, I think right now we're approaching these micromobility systems by saying they're not fitting in the current built environment, therefore we can't have them. I know a council member, forgot the LA council member who actually came out saying that the people who use these e-scooters, the responsibility was actually on their shoulders because they volunteered to use them. And so I think we need to shift that completely, that everyone is trying to get to A to B the safe way they can, and we need to build our streets to make that as easy as possible.
Thanks, John. I do echo the education part, and I do want to highlight City of Santa Monica has a really good education campaign that they're doing called Take the Friendly Road, which I recommend the participants and anyone who's listening on this webinar to check out, where it's really a campaign to show that all mobility options, how they coexist and how to increase more traffic safety through all mobility options. So definitely check that out. And for Rebecca, I know some of these micromobility options have not reached or made their way to your communities, but what would you say are some considerations in terms of planning and education should one day they show up on your streets in your community?
Yeah, these are definitely new types of programs for us. We don't really see them in the Eastern Coachella Valley at all. They're really making their way into the Palm Springs area. But we have been trying, based on community feedback and input, we have been trying to focus a lot more on the different types of micromobility options that exist and can be applicable to rural communities. That includes like different rideshare programs for residents, especially for those who don't have cars and who can't really rely on the public transit system as it is right now. But one of the biggest things, at least in terms of the potential to implement e-bikes and e-scooters here, is considering the really high temperatures that we have in the desert. During the summers, we often reach the 120s, 125, I think was the highest this year. And so when we have extreme weather conditions like this, that deters folks from being outside or from using the active transportation infrastructure that will soon be there. But having programs like e-bikes and e-scooters is definitely the best option, but it's something that we still need to do a lot more research on. And I agree with the previous comments about policy development, because we've heard from different cities who have these types of programs and how they can potentially like increase gentrification or negatively affect the community, which may be unintentional, but it's still something that that could be a consequence of such a program. But we are hoping to implement and do more research on these types of micro transit and micromobility options that are best applicable to the community.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Moving on to our last question about how we should structure the narrative on traffic safety. I'd like to start out the discussion about how we've seen some safety advocates raising an issue about calling or referring to roadway fatalities from crashes, collisions, and other incidents by drivers as quote-unquote accidents. Kind of want to have Kevin elaborate a little bit more on why using the term accident is problematic.
Sure. So the challenge with the term accidents is that it often implies a sense of inevitability or a lack of ability to control and to manage that situation. So it's something that couldn't be avoided, and it's something that couldn't possibly have been the fault of any specific individual. But the reality is that many of these collisions that take place, many of the crashes that take place, are the result of policy and built infrastructure decisions that were made oftentimes many decades ago, and oftentimes are perpetuated because these are this is the paradigm that we all have been brought up under. This is the paradigm that we all grew up in. And so we are not oftentimes in a place to really challenge that status quo. So when people refer to it as an accident involving a bike and a car, there's a sense of alleviating the blame or alleviating the fault from any party that's involved in that collision. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're starting to see amongst the advocacy community is people feel like, no, these are not accidents. These are problems that can be addressed. These are problems that are the result of active decisions being made. We can make policy changes that help to reduce the number of fatalities that happen as a result of collisions. We can make policy changes that make it easier to separate or to better integrate the different modes of traffic, whether it's pedestrian or bike or car or public transit. So there's a movement that continues to kind of grow amongst the advocacy community to really encourage people to transition out and away from the use of the word accident and really call these incidents collisions, crashes, referring to them as incidents, but giving them a term that doesn't have this connotation of inevitability or inability to be changed. And I think that's an important aspect to this is as we create the narrative, we need to make sure that it's clear and that it's understood that there is a lot that we can do. We can improve the built environment. We can make changes that will, we can make policy changes that will make it such that these types of collisions don't have to happen. They can be reduced, and the level of fatalities from them can be reduced. And that's why we are starting to see more and more cities adopt Vision Zero policies. We're starting to see more and more cities kind of really take that seriously. Many European cities have made significant strides in adopting Vision Zero policies, less so in the US, but we're starting to see cities really kind of dive deeper into that and look more closely at how they can really take on some of that. And part of that process really is changing that narrative and making sure that people understand this is not an inevitability. This is something that we genuinely can have an impact and an effect on.
Thanks, Kevin. I think the follow-up question is to John. How is your organization handling or addressing this narrative through your advocacy work?
Yeah, my answer is pretty simple. I mean, Kevin kind of went into it at the end, which is just storytelling. I think any good community organizer at the end of the day is a good storyteller. And so making sure the stories of our communities are out in the public, out in the mainstream narrative, I think is critical. So making, the stories and making sure we go to diverse outlets, whether it's social media or traditional different language outlets, LTEs, submitting, op-eds. I think definitely pushing out the stories, I think, is critical. A strategy that we've used in our organizing work is, to make an argument for traffic safety, I think first it means that you have to care for your streets, right? If you don't care about your streets, and if you don't utilize streets, why would you care about traffic safety? And so one way that we do it is we connect our streets with our history, with our local culture. So for example, the LGBT community. For the LGBT community, finding walkable spaces was a big part of finding our community, making sure that we have spaces where we feel safe, where we have a sense of community. And that's how you have places like West Hollywood, you have Boys Town. And so this is, though it might not directly touch with traffic safety, it shows a sense of ownership, a sense of narrative, and a history of our streetscape. And so once you can show the LGBT community that this is something that's important, then being able to make the argument, then, let's talk about traffic safety. That becomes far more relevant. Another example is the LA civil unrest that happened in the 90s in Los Angeles. I would say that was a story of different communities trying to grapple with who owns their streets and who owns and represents those communities. And so again, tying it to history and culture. Another area that we've seen is generational trauma around streets. Oftentimes kids grow up with their parents and the grandparents telling them that the streets are not safe. It's not a place for play or recreation. And those kind of perceptions is passed down from one generation to the other. And so understanding all of this, and I think packaging this into a narrative form and then be able to share that with other people in sort of in our city, I think it only will really give people a deeper sense of their streets. And I think that is what will really help us make an argument for traffic safety in a city as sort of car-centric as Los Angeles.
Thank you, John. And lastly, Rebecca, if you can touch on this next follow-up question is highlighting the importance of data in the narrative and how sometimes the data gaps in collisions that often go unreported may leave certain communities out of the narrative. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think that right now the narrative of mobility access is a bit centered around urban communities that have much more or can have much more development and capacity and more accessibility to state funding programs. In terms of traffic safety, rural communities can't really demonstrate the need for traffic safety improvements because of these data gaps. We do see collisions happen, but they often go unreported because of different reasons, but we do know that folks have a fear of, for example, if somebody is undocumented, they have a fear of reporting a collision and then facing deportation, or other reasons that folks don't want to deal with the authorities. Or the ratio between collisions and population isn't great enough to call for changes in rural communities. That's one of the biggest issues that we face when we try to apply for state grants, that we just don't have enough density in the Eastern Coachella Valley to have a successful application. And communities of color and others are being left out of the narrative for these reasons. And it's important to look at demographics, at geography, at the different jurisdictions that are responsible, and identify why certain communities aren't seeing the same investment as others to improve traffic safety, and why the narrative doesn't really reflect all of the communities who need it.
Thank you, Rebecca. So in the interest of time, I think we're running good on time. Oh, I'm sorry, John, I forgot there was this one slide. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this.
No, I mean, yeah, no, real quickly, yeah, this is a slide of one of the actions we took. It's called In Our Shoes, and it just highlights those that died from car crashes. So again, sharing stories in a creative way that really the public can engage in. And so this is just one of those examples.
Oh, great. Thank you. So that concludes our topical discussion. We're opening up to Q&A. And for folks who are participating via Zoom. If you have a question, please use the chat box. I don't know, do you have any questions for each other? I actually had a question for John. There's your organization, Los Angeles Walk, and I know in my hometown in Sacramento, there's Sacramento Walks, and in Long Beach, there's Walk Bike Long Beach. Are there any other, is that an organization that exists throughout statewide? You could talk a little bit about that and where other communities can find their local organization like yours.
Yeah, I know California Walks exist, and we're not officially affiliated with them, but they are definitely one of our close partners, and they're up in no, not they're in Oakland, and they are part of they're sort of a network of all the other sort of different walk groups throughout the state. So they definitely would be a great resource to tap into, especially when you want to track state level policies.
Great. Doesn't look like there are other questions. Any other questions from the speakers? Nope. For those who come up with a question later on, here is the contact information for all our speakers who can provide you more information and insight from their organizations. And that concludes our webinar. This is the second webinar of our four-part series. The previous webinar was about data, research and data. We have two more left. One is tomorrow, Wednesday at 2 p.m. about SCAG's Go Human campaign in terms of demonstration events and their advertising campaign. And lastly, closing it with the statewide policy and legislation impacting traffic safety. As we mentioned, these webinars are recorded. You may access it in this link above at the Go Human SoCal website, where you can also access other information, such as information from our traffic safety workshops, as well as our work plan, template on helping cities prioritize their task and a course of action in building safer streets. There's also a menu of activities for cities to enhance safety in their community. Lastly, we also want to encourage, SCAG has actually encouraged all cities and agencies to get on board to enhance safety in our region. You can do so by taking the SCAG Safety Pledge, by going on the Go Human SoCal website and clicking on this link with the yellow circle. And if your city chooses to participate in various ways, such as adopting a Vision Zero plan, to hosting a pop-up safety demonstration, to implementing a safety outreach campaign, can make a difference and go a long way. So sign up online to receive more information from SCAG. Lastly, to close out this webinar, we wanted to mention about SCAG's draft transportation safety technical report. It will be released in November 7th. And will be available for public comments through January 2020, which includes strategies proposed by SCAG for local jurisdictions to implement, as well as its high injury network interactive information and other safety best practices in our region. So with that, thank you to Rebecca, Kevin, and John for your time and your insight in providing such valuable information and engaging in a very interactive and interesting discussion. So
thank you.
Thank you all, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.